Welcome to our sharing on the book of Exodus. I want to complete what I was speaking about in the first episode. There are just a few things left before we actually go into the text. And one of the questions that we need to ask is, if God is truly love and that his approach to us is love and mercy, why would he allow a slavery to go on for 400 or 430 years? That's a question that needs to be answered, and you'll be amazed at the answer. But first of all, I give you a little bit of history and geography, and that is that when, back in the book of Genesis, when Abraham entered the land of Canaan, we wouldn't have been aware of the fact that that land was annexed to Egypt at the time. So it meant that he was actually entering Egypt, even though it was a different country. It's like that countries that are conquered by others, the conquering country claims that country as if it were his own. And many of us have had that experience. As I said already, the judgment of the Amorites did not come in Abraham's time. He was told that his people were going to be in Egypt for 430 years, and then in the fourth generation they would be released. So when Jacob, who was Abraham's grandson, took his 70 members of his family down into Egypt, the other number is 75 if you include Joseph and his family. When he took them down into Egypt in Genesis 46, it was at that point they were told that they would be rescued in the fourth generation. So let's look at this generational thing. When Jacob went down into Egypt, we were told he went down with his sons and his grandsons. That's 3 generations. And we're told that in the fourth generation, they would actually be released. So 3 generations were alive at the same time. So I just want to pick this up because this is quite important. This is not just a personal opinion. So the first generation we're dealing with are Jacob and his 12 sons and their children. Now, in the second generation that traveled with Jacob into Egypt, I just want to pick up Levi as the son, because Levi and the Levites are extremely important in the book of Exodus. One of Levi's sons was a man called Kohath, Kohath in our language, and you'll meet him in Genesis 46 verses 8 and 11. And his son Amram, who was in the third generation, he had other sons as well, happens to be the father of Moses and Aaron, who are the fourth generation. There's the fourth generations. That's not 400 years. Not by any measurement is that 400 years. So it seems that the actual time that Jacob and his family were in Egypt, physically in the land that we call Egypt, is half of that 430, which is 215. And the other 215 is the time between the time of Abraham and the time that we're actually talking about now. So were they enslaved for 215 years? The answer is no. We're told quite clearly at the end of the book of Genesis that throughout Joseph's lifetime, he took care of his family, his extended family in the land of Goshen. He said, I will take care of you, I'll take care of all your needs. Now, we're told that Joseph lived 120 years. So that was 120 years they were not enslaved. And the clue that we're given at the beginning of the book of Exodus is in chapter 1 and verse 6. Then Joseph died and his brothers and all that generation. All that generation is Jacob and his sons. And then we're told in verse 8, then there came to power a new king who knew nothing about Joseph. So nothing happened while Joseph was alive. So that's the first 120 years they had there. They were taken care of. So we know very clearly that the persecution was on at the time when Moses was born. And we're going to be told by the time Moses begins to lead the Exodus, that he's 80 years of age. So the conclusion is that the persecution was going on somewhere between 80 and 100 years. But it's not 430. Sometimes we just jump to conclusions. And if you say 4 generations, for some strange reason, people will presume that a generation is 100 years, when 3 and 4 generations can be alive at the same time. And that's perfectly normal, especially when marriage takes place when people are teenagers. So let's go from that point then. Slavery was not as long as people think, to the significance of the land of Egypt, because everything about the context in which the Exodus took place, everything is significant. Everything is important. The ancient name for Egypt was Mizraim, and Mizraim means 2 straits. That means 2 strips of land on either side of the Nile. And these 2 strips of land are the desert and the part of the land that was made fertile because once a year the Nile overflowed its banks and threw up silt onto the soil and made it actually very fruitful. In fact, we know from the book of Genesis that Egypt was so fruitful that it was the breadbasket for the world at the time. So when a famine came to the whole world, meaning the countries of the Middle East, then everybody went to Egypt. Egypt had food. So this means that the Nile River is extremely important in the story. The Nile represented life for them, but most of the land was desert. And there was this battle going on between life and death all the time in their history. And this aspect of this mystery is actually played out on a higher level spiritually in the book of Exodus, the battle between life and death. And it's actually very important because that is the battle that's going on all around us, everywhere, in every generation, the battle between life and death, eternal life and eternal death. So the life and the death we will look into as well. So since the river Nile was literally the lifeblood of Egypt, they worshipped the thing. All of the problems I'm going to sort of bring up for you here in the book of Exodus, you will understand are all dealt with in the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. For example, you are not to worship anything that's on the earth. You're not to worship the sea or the sky or animals or anything like that. You're not to worship anything like that. Now, as you know, Egypt was a very advanced civilization with an advanced educational system as well. And it had a glorious past, as we know, from the Sphinx and the pyramids. And its temples and monuments were built to outlast time itself, and they have outlasted millennia. And they embalmed the dead because their dead were meant to outlast time as well. They thought that they would come back to life on the earth. And they left us the book of the dead in all their mummification processes. But the people they were trying to eliminate from the earth in slavery and forced labor, they were the ones that God had called to give a different book to the world, and it's the book of life in the Bible, the book that has the message of eternal life. Nothing about mummified dead, nothing about all of these graveyards that they're excavating now and finding it incredible that all of these people went to so much trouble to try and keep the dead alive in some way. Instead of that, we have the book of life, which is the Bible, and it speaks to us about eternal life, that we will live forever. As I said already, in the Bible, Egypt represents the world with all its false religions and its false hopes. Now, these false religions, false gods, and false hopes are all going to be dealt with in the plagues and on Mount Sinai when God declares his new covenant. If we understand this, we will realize the sheer logic of this text. It's absolutely wonderful. And so God is going to send them a representative of his, whom he specifically chooses as an ambassador. And St. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians that he calls each one of us to be his ambassador. That means his official representative upon the earth. And one of the many things that Moses is going to show them is what we say in Latin, sic transit gloria mundi. That's the way the glory of the world just disappears in a flash. And you're going to see this in the plagues. It's going to be demonstrated in a very powerful way. They have to have it shown to them dramatically that the river is not, in fact, the source of their life, that the sun is not the source of their life. They worship the sun, Ra, the sun god. And the king was called Ra Meses, the son of the sun god. So he was partly a demigod himself in his own right as well. And in all of the dealings that Moses will have with Pharaoh, we will see Pharaoh not as a demigod, not as somebody absolutely special. You'll see him as a stubborn, hard-hearted sinner who goes back on his word all the time. And by the time the story is finished, Pharaoh is on his knees. Whereas the book of life tells us, and the covenants of God indicate, that our homeland is in heaven. We have an eternal home. And this is in Philippians chapter 3 from verse 30. There's going to be a war between God and the gods of Egypt. So we need to know something about the religion of Egypt. I'm just going to give it to you in a very cursory way. They worshipped people, that is, their ancestors. They believed that they had come from the stars and that they were destined to go back to the stars. Now, we're not talking about us going to heaven or anything like that. It's just sort of false stuff. And it was because they felt they had come from the stars and that they were star children, if I can put it that way, that they felt they were superior to everybody else and they wouldn't mix with anybody else. They had these elaborate funeral arrangements so that you go back to your origin in the stars, and you know that the pyramids and all of that represent the stars in heaven. So they worshipped the creature, but not the creator. So first of all, they worshipped the creature. This is all going to be very important when we look at the plagues and when we look at Sinai, what God actually proclaims from Sinai. Secondly, they worshipped creation, not the creator. They worshipped the sun, moon, and stars, and they also worshipped animals. And it was one of the reasons why they despised people like the Hebrews, who would kill one of the animals that they actually worshipped, and they would sacrifice this animal to their God. So they worshipped people, they worshipped creation, they worshipped animals. And this is all going to be corrected in the Ten Commandments. But when you look at the falsity that they were actually into, and you come into the third millennium after Christ, you have to ask, are we any better? Because in the world today, people actually worship their own bodies. Philippians 3:19 says, their God is their belly. People today worship material things, money, sex, power, possessions, and so on. And they even worship themselves, which is called autolatry. So when we're looking at these difficulties that they had, please don't think we're any better. We're not. There is an entry point into this world that is different from the kingdom of God. And the entry point of the chosen people into that world represented by Egypt. By the way, when I say Egypt represents the world and represents the evil one, I am not making a comment on the land of Egypt or its people today. I am simply commenting on this text. The chosen people entered the world, represented by Egypt, through their father Jacob. Now, if you remember our reflections on the book of Genesis, you will remember that Jacob was a very conflicted person and he had lots of struggles all his life. So he was presented not as a great saint, but as a struggling human being, right to the very end. And all the problems that his sons had are reflected in that as well. But God's children throughout the whole world actually entered the world as distinct from paradise, represented by Eden, through the conflicting decisions of our father Abraham as well. I just want you to see that this story, which is given to us in the limited circumstances of Israel leaving Egypt at the time of the Exodus, actually is the story of the whole of humanity on a much higher plane. So just like Lot, you remember Lot from the book of Genesis, who went and wanted to live on the outskirts of Sodom, to benefit from all its economy and all its luxury and everything that was going on. It turned into a nightmare for him later on. Well, the exact same thing happened to the sons of Jacob in Egypt. First of all, when they went there, everything was absolutely fine. As long as Joseph was alive, everything was fine. They were taken care of, and they literally flourished. And they did become a nation. They became a numerous people, just as God had said to Abraham that it would happen in Genesis 12:2. God was with them the whole time of this experience through the covenant of Abraham. Now, this is very important, and we're going to see the meaning of this when we come to the burning bush, because the burning bush is actually a symbol of the people of God. And therefore, God was with them in all of their troubles. And then all of a sudden, there's a change, and living happily in the world suddenly becomes a nightmare, as it did for Lot, and as it will do for the people living at the time of the Antichrist as well. So it's when it turns into a nightmare and we become really disturbed by what's going on, God begins to move into our situations. It's God's kairos time for intervention in the human race. So the Exodus begins with darkness and gloom of slavery, but it actually ends in glory. It's a very wonderful thing. So we're now ready to, believe it or not, start in chapter 1. And the very first thing the authors give us is the list of Jacob's sons, in case you have forgotten the book of Genesis, but I'm sure you haven't. And we're told that all of them died in Egypt. Now, in verse 5, it says that Jacob numbered 70 persons, or it's 75 if you include Joseph and his family. And then we're told in verse 6 that Joseph died and his brothers and all that generation. In other words, we're not dealing with Genesis, we're actually moving on to the Exodus. Verse 7 says, "But the sons of Israel were fruitful and they grew in numbers greatly. They increased and they grew so immensely powerful that they filled the land." Now this is the beginning of the nightmare for them. So how can something that is going so well suddenly turn? Very simply, a change of dynasty. Somehow, whatever happened to the pharaohs, a completely new dynasty took over in Egypt. Now, we're not told what the political circumstances were. If it had been the son of the previous pharaoh, he would have known all about the Hebrews and all about Joseph and everything else, and the Hebrews would have been safe. But if there's a completely new dynasty coming from a different area taking over, then this is a big upheaval. Now, the traditional thing says that this person that we're going to be dealing with is Ramesses. I think we need to put a question on that. We need to put a question on the timing of the Exodus as well, and the journey, and lots of things which I will tell you as we go along. So we have something of discontinuity going on in Egypt. So let's use the word foreign king takes over. Knows nothing about what has gone on before him, obviously doesn't care and doesn't bother looking into the history of what has gone on before him, wants to make a clean sweep of everything, and decides he doesn't like those folks up in Goshen. That's where the problem starts. Because I told you they were very prejudiced and there was a lot of racial discrimination. So the new king realizes, he's taking stock of the land, and he realizes that Israel has become very powerful because they're very numerous. He doesn't like them. He refuses to negotiate with them because he could easily have done that. and he separates the nation into us and them. Now, there is the problem. The moment we decide to put discrimination between people because of colour or race or religion or language or anything else, the moment we do that, we have created an artificial problem, and it's them and us. And once you can put people into a them and us situation, you can give yourself the excuse that you can conquer them or do whatever you think is right for them. Because this Pharaoh doesn't know the history of these people who have been living quietly for at least 200 years in the land and have not done any harm to anybody, they've simply increased and prospered in the land. Because he has taken this very prejudiced approach to them, he fears them. And he decides that the only way to deal with this people is to actually put them under control. And under control in those days meant forced labour. And forced labour was actually very common in the ancient world. And even much, much later, even in Israel, King Solomon used forced labour among his own people, which is incredible. As soon as he decides this, then the first persecution of the people of God is related in the Bible. This is the first one, because you've heard me saying from doing the book of Genesis how many firsts there are in these early books of the Bible. Well, this is the first persecution. There will be many persecutions after this throughout history. In verse 10, this new king, whoever he is, says, "We must be prudent and take steps against them increasing any further." And the excuse he gives is, because if war breaks out, they might add to the number of our enemies. Well, if Egypt is the superpower of the day, they're supposed to have the greatest army on earth. And you'll be told this down at the Red Sea, that they have picked teams of specialised military men. Apparently their military was renowned. So this is a very lame excuse, that ordinary human beings working in the fields with agriculture and dealing with cattle and livestock, that they would be a danger to you. No, that's a very lame excuse. So the text says in verse 11, "Accordingly they put slave drivers over the Israelites to wear them down with heavy loads." Now I want you to hear that language, to wear them down with heavy loads. In other words, that you would actually make the people depressed. You would take away from them their desire to increase and multiply, as God told the human race to increase and multiply and fill the earth and conquer it. So in increasing and multiplying, they're simply obeying the Creator, as all creation does. So it isn't just a case of putting these people under control. He actually wants to destroy them. And we're going to see this further as we go along. In this way, they built the store cities of Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh. Why does the text go to the trouble of telling us that two famous cities were actually built by these slave people? There's something behind it that the authors want to hint at, and it'll only become relevant as we go on in the text and as we go on into the book of Numbers and into the book of Joshua. And that is that they had now increased in numbers to become large enough to be a nation, but they needed to know how to build. It wasn't sufficient. They couldn't continue being nomads, and they couldn't continue just moving from one place to another as nomads would. They have got to be able to settle, and they've got to be able to build cities. And so all the skills that they needed in building a nation, building a structure, as I'll show you later, building a proper religion, which I'll show you later, having a proper leadership structure, which I will show you later, and being able to actually build their cities. And they learned the skills of the military from the Egyptians as well. They actually were in a school learning how to be a nation. They could no longer be nomads like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. That wouldn't fit. They had to actually go forward in their progress. So God actually permits this. So they build these store cities. But then we're told in verse 12, the more they were crushed, the more they increased and spread. I'm going to give you commentary on this later. The more they were crushed, the more they increased. In other words, the Pharaoh set out to destroy them, to crush them with heavy loads. But the more they were oppressed, the more they actually grew. Now, this is very important on a spiritual level, which I will deal with later. I just want to give you some text that I will be commenting on. And so men came to dread the sons of Israel, men meaning the leaders of Egypt. The Egyptians forced the sons of Israel into slavery and made their lives unbearable with hard labor, with work with clay and with brick, and works, all kinds of work in the fields. Now, they would have been used to work in the fields, but not with the time that would have been given to them and the pressure that was put on them. And they forced them into every kind of labor. So this is the beginning of the trouble for the people of God. And it begins with somebody wanting to crush them. Well, a comment that you'll find in the book of Proverbs, chapter 12, verse 10 says that the wicked man's heart is ruthless. Now, we have seen this in 2 world wars in the 20th century, that leaders have been completely ruthless, killing millions of people. What the Bible is actually telling us is what human beings are actually like. Okay, so the world's hatred for God's people is the first thing that's being pointed out to us. And this is going to persist throughout all of the Old Testament, all of the New Testament, right up to the very end, at the time of the Antichrist, until the second coming of Christ. Why is that? That is because there is somebody else that Pharaoh merely represents. The unseen enemy is actually the one we actually have to deal with. St. Paul tells us in Ephesians that our enemies are not flesh and blood. Our enemies are the powers of darkness in high places. And Satan, because he's an angel, knew what God's plan for the human race was. He knew, he was there when Genesis 3:15 was actually pronounced. He knew there was a Redeemer coming. And if a Redeemer was coming, he would come through a chosen line. And if that chosen line could be found, he could actually destroy it. So what Satan is trying to do is destroy the bloodline to Christ. Because it's Christ he wants to destroy. The battle is between the demon and the Savior. It's between the two of them on the higher planes, and it's played out in the decisions that human beings make upon the earth. You remember Jesus said to his apostles in John 15, verses 18 and 19, "If the world hates you," he said, "remember, it hated me before you." Because Jesus is the real target. But throughout this entire text, you'll hear that God was with them. God was with them. God was with them. Throughout all of their struggles, God is with them. Go into the New Testament, the very last thing you have in Matthew's Gospel is Jesus promising, "I will be with you on all the days that are coming, right to the very end." God is with us. And Paul says in Romans 8:31, if God is on your side, who can be against you? Now, Pharaoh is going to lose this battle. Satan ultimately will lose the battle as well. But Satan, being a spirit, an angel, will continue the battle as long as he can. Why? Because he wants to rob Jesus of his harvest, and you and I are part of that harvest. That's why we come under attack. Satan doesn't care about us. We're nothings. It's Christ he wants to prevent having his harvest and having his victory. Why? Because we were baptized into Christ, we are part of him. So in attacking us, he's attacking him. So at the time of the Exodus, Christ is the pre-incarnate Christ, and the attack is upon the people he has chosen. It doesn't mean that they are special in the sense of being holier than anybody else. It doesn't mean that. It's just that God had to choose somebody. But God is with these people. What has been said here in these verses that I've read for you has happened throughout the whole of history. Whenever the church is persecuted, actually the faith increases and people come to know the Lord better, and the church actually grows and grows, and it is utterly purified through the persecution. Tertullian, who is one of the early church fathers, said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. So while Satan is opposing us and while he is bringing about disasters, at the same time, God turns those disasters right around to be part of his victory. And so when you come to the final persecution of God's people in the book of Revelation, you'll find that it is the martyrs are the ones who are praised all the time. Pharaoh and everybody else who represents someone like this throughout history, including up to modern times, will learn to their cost that you don't fight God and win. You can fight God, but you won't win. And this is the reason why. Isaiah tells us in chapter 46 and verse 10 of his book, "From the beginning I foretold the future," the Lord said. "I predicted it beforehand what was going to be. I say, my purpose will last. I will do whatever I choose." Now there is the Creator and Lord of the universe speaking to us through his prophet. Now the problem with people like Pharaoh and world leaders is that they think they are gods and they think they can do what they like, and that there will be no consequences for them. They have to learn that that is absolutely untrue. There is only one Lord. There is only one God. There is only one ruler of the earth. On a much higher plane that Pharaoh would never ever have understood. If you think of Israel as a newborn, because it is just becoming a nation here in Israel, the land of Egypt turned out to be the womb in which Israel was nurtured and it grew, and the Exodus is the birth where she was cast out of that womb and put on her journey through the wilderness, which we will deal with in the book of Numbers, to reach the promised land. But the strange thing is that at the time of Christ, Israel herself had become the womb of the new people of God, the church. And all during the lifetime of Christ, this new being was being nurtured and was growing, and after the death and resurrection of Jesus was catapulted out of Israel and started its long journey through history, through the Gentile territories. And so you've got this mystery going on. So Egypt is the womb for Israel to develop until it's born in the Exodus, and Israel is the womb for the church to develop until she is born in the death and resurrection of Jesus. It depends on how you react to persecution and suffering as to what will come out of it. People who are wise will not work against it, because you can't get through life without suffering. It's not actually possible. I've heard it said that suffering and persecution is like a ship out on the ocean and they see this huge rogue wave coming at them. And it looks as if it's going to absolutely destroy the ship. People manning the ship are skilled. They can actually manage to let that wave turn them around and send them forward in an absolutely wonderful way and shorten their journey hugely. So in other words, the suffering and the persecution can actually benefit the people of God. And so no matter what this Pharaoh decides against the people of God, he cannot destroy their future, because their future has been decided in the eternal realms ab aeterno. God had said, and God is truth itself, God had said to Abraham that the people would be delivered in the 4th generation. And they were. Because what God says happens. When God said, let there be light, there was light. When God said, let us make man in our own likeness, that's exactly what he did. Whatever God says, he does. And we're going to see, as I've said, a huge contrast between what God says and does and what human beings say and do. So Psalm 33 verse 11 says, the counsel of the Lord, in other words, his decisions, last forever. The plans of his heart stand forever. You cannot change them. So, since God's plan was to liberate these people out of Egypt, that was what was going to happen no matter what opposition Pharaoh gave. This is very important because when you apply that to us as well, no matter what the world does against the church, what Jesus has planned for the church will happen, even if the church suffers and is wounded and all the rest of it. Listen to this from Isaiah again, Isaiah 54:17. The weapons formed against you will not prosper. This is the heritage of the servants of God, that their righteousness is from me, says the Lord. Now we have nothing of ourselves, everything comes through him, with him, and from him. So, if God is a good God, and Jesus said that nobody is good except God alone, so if God is a good God, what good came out of this persecution? What good came out of this slavery? Wouldn't you think that no good could come out of slavery? Let me show you. First of all, their sufferings disturbed them. Secondly, their sufferings purified them. Thirdly, their sufferings unified them. Because you may be a large nation, but we can be divided up into many, many, many parts. It unified them. They became one. And it disenchanted them from life in Egypt. Now that is a very, very big thing. I could say that in one sentence. It unseated them. It made them get up and maybe even want to go. With God's intervention and with all the actions that God's going to do for them, they might actually just choose God. He's chosen them, but to have a marriage, two people have to choose each other. And that marriage is Mount Sinai, the covenant on Sinai. So they might even choose God. They might actually agree to accept the inheritance that has been given to them, which is the land of Canaan. And they might even agree to leave Egypt. But human beings find it very, very difficult to change their way of life, to get up and go. And we're told that at the time of the Antichrist, this has to happen for Christians as well. So the next thing is that because the people are not disintegrating and falling apart, they're actually improving, the Pharaoh decides on the final solution to the Jews. That expression was used by another tyrant in the 20th century. The final solution to the Jews, let's kill them. The king of Egypt then spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah. I'll talk about that again. When you midwives attend Hebrew women, he said, watch the two stones carefully. That's the bench on which the person is lying for birthing. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. But the midwives were God-fearing. They disobeyed the command of the king of Egypt and let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives. Why, he asked them, have you done this and spared the boys? The Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, they answered. Wow, isn't it wonderful if you can get your own back? They are hardy. Why are they hardy? Because of all the hardship that they're experiencing in the slavery. And they give birth before the midwife actually reaches them. And God was kind to the midwives. And the people went on increasing and grew very powerful. And since the midwives reverenced God, God granted them descendants. I'm going to pick up this story in the next episode. Thank you for listening. Slán agus banach dé live. Goodbye. God bless you.